Hey everyone, welcome to Talking with Guy, and today I have with me Rahsaan Hall, and he's running for DA for the Plymouth County.
Yes.
How you doing?
I'm well. Thank you for having me, Guy.
Pleasure's mine.
Yeah.
Starting off, it's a question I usually ask most of my guests. During your childhood years, did you aspire to be running in the political field, or was this your dream?
Yeah, I never had, as a child, any political aspirations. I wasn't exposed to it in any meaningful way and really didn't think about it. I wanted to be an inventor, which I think in retrospect, I wanted to be a professor. And the reason I wanted to be a professor is because I liked to create things, and the person that I saw creating things was the professor on Gilligan's Island. And so that's what I thought a professor was. Even though my father was a law professor, I was still intrigued by the idea of, either science and engineering, and that's what I thought I wanted to do. And of course, as I grew older, developed an interest in sports, and ultimately thought I was going to be an architect, but ended up going to law school, and the rest is kind of history.
You mentioned that your father was a law professor.
Yes.
Did that have any influence in going to law school? Or?
It did. It had a great influence. When I was younger, my father, I think for a brief moment worked at the Federal Trade Commission in Chicago, and then started teaching. He taught at Ole Miss Law School, and then he taught at Oklahoma University Law School, and then ended up teaching at Northeastern University School of Law. And so while I was an undergrad, as an architecture major, I realized that I really didn't have a passion for architecture. And in speaking with my father, we talked about the possibility of changing majors to either sociology or political science and going to law school. And at that point in my life, I was more focused about the salary that I would make. And he said, well, you could come out making more as an attorney than you would as an architect. And so that was enough for me. I was concerned about civil rights and racial justice issues at the time, but not as a driving force of what led me to law school. So after my sophomore year of college, I switched to political science, graduated, and then applied and got accepted to law school.
I see in your policy that equal rights and racial justice. I see that into your policies. So that's always been something that's been core to your part.
Yeah. Growing up, having parents who, grew up in the 50s and 60s, were witness to the civil rights movement, were active on their college campus at Kansas State University and engaged in student organizing on behalf of black students. They exposed me to some of the injustices that existed in the world. I grew up watching the PBS documentary Eyes on the Prize. That gave me further perspective on the issues of race and racism in this country. When I was in high school, hip hop music at that time was really focusing on what we now call racial justice issues. And when I was in college and law school, those were the issues in society that I was concerned about. Rodney King, Abner Louima, any number of people are some of the same things that we've seen advocacy about in the last decade. And so those were things that were a persistent part of my rearing and education. My father giving me books about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King when I was a child, and books about black history. So I had that information that I wasn't getting in the schools, that wasn't affirming who or what was being taught in the schools wasn't necessarily affirming or telling a full scope of the history of this country or of Black people in particular's role and experience in the country?
Being raised in, because from the sound of it, your parents were well educated, and also they had experience, because you said being 50s and 60s. Did that change the dynamic of the perspective that you had in life, or how did that impact the way you view the world in a sense?
Yeah, I think, like I was saying, what I was exposed to early on, the historical record of injustices was something that was familiar to me. I think there are a lot of people who grow up understanding America to be this nation that is free of blemishes because of the way history is taught in school. And then they have this reckoning in life when they are confronted with injustices and, have this moment of cognitive dissonance where the thing that they believe about our country is then challenged. And some people become defensive about it, and other people want to lean in and learn more. And so from a very early age, I saw the history of how Black people in particular, but other marginalized groups had been treated throughout history. And so that was the lens through which I viewed some of the systems. But, ultimately what I saw was people organizing and rallying together to make this country live up to its promises. I'm reminded of the words of James Baldwin, and not to quote him exactly, but to paraphrase, he says, "I love America more than anybody else, and because of that, it gives me the right to persistently critique her." And so that is the way that I've approached it. The legacy of my ancestors is what has made this country what it is, right? I am the descendant of enslaved Africans who provided free labor to this country. That was the economic engine to create the greatness that exists here. And I am invested in wanting to see America live up to the promises that are embedded in its founding documents as amended to incorporate everyone.
There's something you said, just to paraphrase. You said something along the lines of that you've seen people rallying and changing, and there are multiple demographics. And I believe that. Do you believe that the way that we see those people, we should change how we measure up to better help those people, or what is your opinion on like that sense of?
Yeah, if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think exposure to different groups of people is going to bring us, hopefully, we have a greater level of empathy and a willingness and desire to be able to bridge the difference that exists between people. I think there is a lot of divisive political rhetoric that exists in our country right now, and it makes it difficult for people to come together and work together to solve issues in furtherance of the common good. But I don't think that's anything new. Throughout this nation's history, there's always been those divisive conversations. We had a civil war over the division of ideas and perspectives, but we've always managed to continue to exist as a nation. But I think we get greater and better outcomes when we are more empathetic and understanding and seeking to learn from people not like ourselves, and in particular, people who are from marginalized and oppressed groups, listening to the experience of those people. The greatest indicator of who we are as a country is how we treat our most vulnerable. There's a parable in the Bible where Jesus talks about a great king who told people, when I was hungry, you didn't feed me. When I was in prison, you didn't visit me. When I was naked, you didn't clothe me. And the people were like, well, when did we ever do this to you? And he said, whenever you did this to the least of these, you did it unto me. And so we've got to think about how we are treating the least least of these. And so coming together with people unlike ourselves and people who are on the margins of society, if we're doing right by them and doing right by others, I think we're doing right by ourselves as a nation.
Your prior role was you were a lawyer?
Yes, I'm still a lawyer, but I worked for an organization called the ACLU of Massachusetts.
What did they do?
And so the ACLU of Massachusetts is a civil rights and civil liberties organization. They advocate in the courts, in the legislature, and in community to protect people's civil rights. And so the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution, for the most part, are the things that the American Civil Liberties Union advocates around. And so I was a part of the Massachusetts office of the American Civil Liberties Union. I was the director of the racial justice program. And so my role there was to do advocacy and policy work, a little bit of litigation on racial justice issues. So to the extent that there are civil rights and civil liberties that implicate racial justice issues, like policing, like the criminal legal system reform, or district attorneys, or voting rights, I was engaged in initiatives to engage the community or influence the legislature to change some of the laws, or be a part of litigation, impact litigation that wasn't just the case of one person to address their individual issue, but maybe the case of a person or a larger group that would make structural change to an issue.
It sounded like you were impacting the community in a great way.
Yeah, I felt like it. And, and before I was at the ACLU, I was at another job, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, where I was the director, the deputy director there. And the years that I was there, I handled race and national origin discrimination cases. So when people were treated unfairly on their job because of their race or the country that they were from, or voting rights cases, or people were discriminated against in housing, or voting rights, police misconduct cases. And so those were some of the cases that I handled. I also did some legislative advocacy. And before that, I was a prosecutor. I prosecuted cases in Suffolk County, which is Boston, Chelsea, Revere, and Winthrop. And I was there for 8 years, and I handled, your run-of-the-mill motor vehicle offenses, schoolyard fights, domestic violence cases. But the longer I was there, I handled more severe cases, shooting cases, gun cases, drug and gang cases, and homicide cases.
Why the current shift from being someone that was a lawyer now to district attorney?
So one of the things that I did when I was at the ACLU was run a public education campaign called What a Difference a DA Makes. I knew from my own experience about the role, the power, and the influence of a district attorney because I was an assistant district attorney for 8 years. I noticed that in the ACLU, when I was there, there was a conversation that was happening both nationally and in our office about the amount of energy and attention that was being given to the criminal justice system and specific players within the criminal justice system. A lot of people were focusing on prisons and a lot of people were focusing on police. But there's a key player in that whole equation that people weren't talking about, and it's one of the most powerful people in the system, and it was the district attorney. And so we did some surveying, and we found out that 4 out of 10 Massachusetts voters didn't know that the district attorney was an elected position. And we found out that over half of Massachusetts voters didn't even think the DA had that much power. But when we confronted people with the information about what it is district attorneys do and how much power and influence they have, 81% of voters said that they would pay more attention in the next district attorney's election. And back in 2018, when we did this campaign, there were 5 contested DA races all in that year. There hadn't been that many in one year for 36 years, I think. And so we went across the Commonwealth, talking to groups, educating them on the role, power, and influence of district attorney, and we saw a significant increase in ballots cast for district attorney. And as a result, there were 2 progressive district attorneys that were elected, Rachel Rollins out of Suffolk County and Andrea Harrington out of Berkshire County. And that work that I did, engaging with people across the Commonwealth, but particularly here in Plymouth County really got me thinking about it. And the more that I was engaged in conversations with my neighbors and friends who I live with in Brockton, but also around Plymouth County, I learned about the level of dissatisfaction that people had, the concerns about some of the injustices in this current district attorney's office, the lack of transparency and accountability. And so I thought about it. I talked to my family about it. I prayed on it, and I decided to run.
You mentioned transparency. What is one of the major ways that you see that there's a lack of transparency in the current
DA's office? Yeah. Sure. I think one of the problems within the system are some of the gross racial disparities that exist. Black and Latinx people are disproportionately prosecuted, sentenced, and incarcerated, including here in Massachusetts, including here in Plymouth County. But the DA's office doesn't provide any information or data about that. We don't know any of the prosecution statistics. We also don't know any of the policies that the office has. And the reason that I know that is because when I was at the ACLU, there was a lawsuit that was filed. And the reason it was filed is because we sent public records requests to all 11 district attorneys throughout Massachusetts. And all of them except one sent us the records that we had requested either for free or for a nominal charge. Some of them even sent us more records than we actually asked for. The one that didn't was the Plymouth County District Attorney's Office. They sent a letter back saying it will cost $1.2 million to provide those records. And that's just not transparency. And so we filed a lawsuit. We called them to let them know that we were filing the lawsuit, and they went out and hired a law firm on our tax dollars, only to turn around and give us the records we requested for free, which is what they should have and could have done from the outset. And the things that we were asking for were what their policies were on bail, what their policies were on dealing with people with substance use disorder or mental health issues, what their policies were on avoiding some of the racial disparities, what type of trainings were they doing for their assistant district attorneys. That's information that the public should know of a public agency. And so that's a major issue of transparency that is a significant concern, not only to me, but other residents of Plymouth County.
Well, I used to have a notion that most, or like public, or government officials, they have to be disclosing things, and I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, and so ultimately they did disclose it, but it took a lawsuit to disclose it, and it shouldn't have had to take in a lawsuit. And let me say, the role of the district attorney's office and prosecutors has evolved over time, because there was a period of time where the only thing that prosecutors were perceived to be responsible for was prosecuting criminal cases. And to a large extent, that is still the role, but because of our understanding of society and the role of the criminal legal system and the harms that are produced by this system, because our understanding of those things have changed, the role of the district attorney's office has to change if we want to get better outcomes. And so that's why it's important that it's just not seen as an office that just is like a factory that's just churning through cases, but being thoughtful and having clear policies. It's 2022. We should be able to evaluate the outcomes of an office like this instead of having an outdated case management system where we can't tell how many cases were prosecuted in a particular year and whether or not there was a racial disparity in any of those cases. And I'll just say another thing. One of the things that is also informing my approach to this is that I'm an ordained reverend. And so in addition to being a civil rights attorney and a former prosecutor, I'm an ordained reverend. And part of the work that I've done, I've ministered to families who have lost loved ones in the criminal legal system or who have lost loved ones to violence. I've been involved in youth ministry with young people, trying to make sure that they stay on the right path to avoid being ensnared in this system. And, I'm informed and inspired by scripture that says, what is it that the Lord requires of you, which is to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. And so to your earlier question about why the shift, I think that's something else, is to do justice and make sure that everybody, regardless of where you live in Plymouth County, how much money you make, or the color of your skin, that you experience this system in a way that is fair, that is equitable, and that's just. There's some people in Plymouth County that haven't had any problems. They think the system works just fine because they've never been a victim of crime. They've never had a family member or loved one who's a victim of crime. They've never been prosecuted or have had a family member or loved one who's been prosecuted. So to them, from all intents and purposes, it seems like it's working fine. But there are a lot of people, particularly in poor communities and communities of color within this county, who don't have that same experience. And that's what I'm really seeking to do, is to make sure that this system operates fairly for everyone, regardless of who you are.
Yeah, and my mind is still boggled by the previous statement that you put that was put forward. So I'm kind of like at a loss for words at the moment.
And but, anything that I say about this current administration, you can look up any Globe or Enterprise article and find some of the very things that I'm concerned about. You can find them there.
Yeah, for sure. I'm just like, to me, I just shocked over like taking a loss to be like, hey, my policies are X, Y, Z.
Right.
But yeah, that's wild.
Tell me about it.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Is there anything that message specifically that you would like to put out for people that are going to vote? Something that you want them to know that is like one of the crucial reasons why they should pay attention for the DA election that's happening right now?
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you giving me this opportunity, for having me on your show. As I said, I'm running to have a system that works fairly for everyone. And the theme of my campaign has been reclaiming the spirit of justice, because there have been too many injustices in this system for too many people. And so there are some who think that the role of the prosecutor and law enforcement should be uplifting law and order. And I agree. However, I'm also reminded of the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who say that law and order exist to create justice. And when they fail in that, they become dangerous dams that block the flow of social progress. And so when you look at these racial disparities and the wrongful convictions and the miscarriages of justice and the unjust prosecutions and the unsolved crimes, it's hard to call it a system of justice. And so we have to reclaim that spirit of justice for everyone. Again, regardless of what neighborhood or town you live in this county, regardless of how much money you make, and regardless of the color of your skin. And so if people want to learn more about me, my background, my history, the things that I stand for, my campaign platform, you can go to my campaign website. It's hallforda.com. That's Hall, Hall, the number 4. And I would just like to invite your viewers to humbly invite them to consider visiting that website, but also casting a vote for me on or before November 8th. Early voting has already started. Mail-in voting has already started. So if people are so inclined, please cast your vote for Rahsaan Hall for District Attorney.
All right. And ladies and gentlemen, this has been Talking with Guy. See you next time.